All right, everyone, as we have folks logging in, we are just going to wait a couple minutes and then I'll start the introductions. Thank you all for joining us today.
Absolutely, thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right. So welcome to everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Hudnut. I am the Vice Co-Chair of the American Constitution Society's Los Angeles Lawyer Chapter. I just wanted to welcome all of you and thank you for joining today for our fifth panel in our series of discussions on racial justice and the law. ACS Los Angeles has committed to challenging and disrupting systems of oppression by launching a series of discussions focused on unpacking and understanding systemic racism within the context of various areas of the law, as well as sharing recommendations in law and policy that you all can use to uplift the movement for equity and justice. This discussion will focus on how homelessness has disproportionately affected BIPOC communities and created overrepresentation across Los Angeles of Black individuals experiencing homelessness. To quantify this fact, a recent study conducted by the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority found that Black people represented only 9% of the general population of Los Angeles County, yet comprise 40% of the population experiencing homelessness. Over the course of this discussion, we will explore homelessness as a byproduct of institutional and systemic racism that exists in public education, the criminal legal system, housing, employment, healthcare, and access to opportunity. We will also hear from our panelists on how we can better advocate for our homeless neighbors and consciously confront and address systemic racism and its outcomes. We would also like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Mexican American Bar Association, the Fair Housing Collective, the ACS Bay Area, San Diego, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Austin lawyer chapters, the ACS OC chapter, and the ACS student chapters at USC, UCLA, Pepperdine, and Loyola Law Schools. Information regarding MCLE credit for all California lawyers out there will be available on the event page, and we will also be sending out an email later linking to the recording of this event, as well as those CLE documents. During our event, we will have a Q&A session, so please submit your questions directly to the Q&A box anytime during the event. I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists and moderator. And in the interest of keeping things brief, we invite you to look up their more detailed bios after the event. Our moderator today is Professor Jody David Armour. He is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. He has recently released a book entitled N*GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. Links to purchase Professor Armour's book will be added to the chat. We are also honored to welcome the Honorable Kevin De Leon. He is a Los Angeles City Council member representing the 14th District, which encompasses downtown LA, El Sereno, Boyle Heights, and Northeast LA. Prior to joining the Los Angeles City Council, he was a professor, senior analyst, and distinguished policymaker in residence at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, as well as the Distinguished Fellow for Climate, Environmental Justice, and Health with the USC Schwarzenegger Institute at USC. And he previously served his constituents in the California State Senate, where he was elected by his colleagues as the president pro tempore, making him the first Latino to serve in that role in over a century. Prior to being elected to public office, Kevin worked as a community organizer and teacher. We're also waiting on one additional panelist, Chancellor Al-Mansour, who will be joining us for her second panel with us, and we are so excited to have her back. She is the executive director of the Housing Rights Center here in Los Angeles. She has chaired the California Reinvestment Coalition and serves on the boards of the National Fair Housing Alliance and several homelessness prevention committees. She has authored articles on fair housing advocacy and lectured at USC, UCLA, and Loyola Law Schools. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. And without further ado, I will pass the mic to Professor Armour.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I'll kind of set the table by contextualizing this discussion in relation to the other discussions we've had throughout this series. This series has been a response to what we saw in the streets. The streets were roiling with protesters who were objecting to two primary things, I heard anyway: criminal justice system reform, serious criminal justice system reform at both ends, at the police brutality end and at the racialized mass incarceration end, and systemic racism, right? And both of those were on the ballot. Both of those issues were on the ballot in LA in November, right? And the voters of LA heard the marchers in the street and responded both positively to both issues when they were on the ballot. Number one, they brought in George Gascon to replace Jackie Lacey, a traditional law and order, tough on crime prosecutor, with George Gascon promising to bring in a progressive prosecution approach, which he followed through with a series of directives, that became controversial, and he's being resisted by many of the old guard within the DA's office. Number one, the voters voted him in, and the voters voted in Measure J, which takes 10% of the county budget, which is, could be up to 10 billion, so up to $1 billion roughly a year, and dedicates it to non-incarceration alternatives. Right, that is alternatives to incarceration, dedicated, right? You don't have to call it defund the police if you don't want. You know, it was essentially responding to that plea in the streets. And then systemic racism was on the ballot too, with regard to affirmative action. It wasn't rolled out very effectively, but what you saw was the voters in LA County, voted in favor of the affirmative action ballot measure, right? Not the rest of and San Francisco did too, not a lot of the rest of the state, but the Angelenos heard the pleas from the street and responded even when it came to systemic racism. So now we're looking at another face of systemic racism, which is housing. And the shocking sight that you see when you walk through downtown LA, which it has the highest concentration of houseless people in America, and therefore is the fiercest expression of structural violence in America. And you look to your left and your right, Forrest Stewart has a book out, Down, Out, and Under Arrest on this, ethnographer up at Stanford. 75% of those faces are Black, right? When you walk through downtown LA. Those are just the numbers. And so how does that connect with the criminal justice system? How does the housing issue connect with our approach to houselessness, connect to the criminal justice issue, which we kind of kicked off this series with? Well, LA launched what they called the Safer Cities Initiative in 2006, in which they decided that they were going to solve the problem of homelessness by cracking down on the down and out, right? By putting over 80 new officers in that area, making it the most heavily policed area in America for its square footage, and then proceeding to cite and crack down with all kinds of citations and other violations on the homelessness, for their own good though, right? The idea was the problem of homelessness is people's inner deficiencies. They are broken internally and they lack sufficient personal responsibility. So what we'll do is we'll tell them you can take care of this citation by going down to one of these mega shelters and getting into one of their essentially 12 steps kind of programs, that because the problem is internal, of course, it's you. It's not a lack of availability of affordable housing. It's not a lack of jobs. There's not a lack of affordable health care and mental health care included. There's not, drug interdiction or drug treatment, those kind of, it's just really the internal, deficiencies. And so that's how we're going to solve it. We use the police to crack down on the down and out like that under the Safer Cities Initiative in LA for years, and it's proven to be a monumental failure. Look at the numbers. Don't take my word, look at the numbers. How much good did that do? All of that punitive response to houseless people in LA, how much good did it really do? And so now we have, fortunately, with people like the councilman that I'm getting ready to pose some questions to, he is bringing a non-punitive approach to the problem. He's not, from what I can see, and he's going to get a chance to elaborate, he's not repeating errors of the past, but is trying to strike out in a more productive direction. And so let me start with that, Kevin. Can you tell us about your proposal to create 50,000 beds by 2025 in an effort to increase the available permanent supportive housing in LA? Can you tell us about that and any other measures that you have in the works to help our neighbors experiencing homelessness?
Well, Professor, I want to thank you very much for the question. I want to thank you very much for your incredible leadership at USC Law School. And let me sort of kind of break it down in the following manner. On any given night, we have more than 41,000 people living on our streets, our parks, our alleyways, our cars and RVs. And the bottom line is this: men, women, and increasingly children, living below underpasses and overpasses are forced to endure the elements during these very cold winter months, all day, all night. And no one feels this more than I do and my constituents in City 14. Because if the city of LA is the epicenter of the nation's homelessness crisis, then my district is ground zero. Now, I want to put this in context because City 14 has over 8,000 unhoused residents. That was before the count of the pandemic. That's more unhoused individuals than the cities of Phoenix, Houston, and Chicago, the number 5, 4, and 3 largest cities in the country, respectively. So sadly, our great city has lacked around what I call a North Star, a clearly defined objective and timeline for achieving that objective, a way home for the people we represent to hold us accountable for delivering results. So my plan, A Way Home, boldly calls for creating 25,000 homeless housing units by the year 2025. This plan starts as a comprehensive overhaul of outdated and cumbersome city policies and regulations that impede our ability to construct the thousands of safe and affordable housing units we need for unhoused friends, neighbors, and loved ones living on the streets today. But changing policies and regulations is simply not enough. We keep saying that this is a humanitarian crisis, but we haven't shifted our institutional priorities to reflect that with a sense of urgency. I think we have to realign the tactical response of our city departments, streamline the bureaucracies that stand in the way of building the housing that we so desperately need. A Way Home is a multi-pronged approach that establishes a goal and a timeline, directs departments to take immediate action and to begin an analysis of citywide property inventories. It also requires a comprehensive analysis of the city's measure HHH projects, for example, particularly the ones in which commitments have been made, but shovels have yet to strike the ground. And I'll say that among the efforts to spur rapid construction of needed housing units, I'm also seeking to establish a permanent renters relief registry and fund for Los Angeles residents who need help with the rent. By this, these are just the starting points, but let me underscore the following, because when you go to Skid Row, and you know that the vast majority of the folks in Skid Row are people of color. And the vast majority of those people of color are Black. And that's the bottom line. And let me say this, is that we have to move with a sense of urgency and a sense of immediacy beyond the academic philosophical rhetoric, is that if you're homeless or if you're unhoused, it's because you don't have a roof over your head. And regardless of how you became homeless, and we know we can be here for hours in terms of institutional racism, in terms of the systemic, racism that impacts disproportionately people of color, and in this case, African-American community in the city of Los Angeles, Latinos as well, and others. But homelessness is very complex as we know it. But there are things, for example, unless the pharmaceutical companies are going to come up with a miracle pill overnight and say, with this pill, schizophrenia, bipolarness, whatever you may have on the spectrum, it will be eliminated. Now, we have the DEA, we have Customs and Border Patrol, we have the AFT or ATF, I should say. We have the FBI, we have the LAPD, we have the LA County Sheriff, we have every intra-agency law enforcement task force imaginable. And still, they haven't stopped the flow of illicit drugs coming into the United States because of our voracious appetite. So when we talk about addictions to illicit drugs, whether it be crystal meth, whether it be heroin, those drugs have been flowing. So with all that government, institutions, the government institute, they still haven't curtailed the vast majority of that flow. So when we talk about drugs, addictions, when we talk about mental illnesses that is part of our lives, our families, our colleagues, our co-workers, when we talk about institutional systemic racism, we have to keep marching forward. But what is within our control, what is within reach, is our ability to provide a roof over our unhoused community members' heads. And a lot of this has been, I think, self-injurious, circular firing squad among bureaucrats and departments who don't speak with each other. And how do we facilitate? How do we do this efficiently? Because if we had an earthquake in Los Angeles and we had 50,000, 60,000 people living in tents, there would be a state of emergency. And all hell would break loose to make sure that we do everything within our power to put a roof over their head in some form, way, or shape, however that's manifested. And that's why you need a plan, number one, a real plan, a plan that's tangible, that's concrete. It can't be just rhetoric and philosophical, rhetoric that makes us feel viscerally good. You need a real plan that's clear and objective. And I know that politicians are loath to put a number out there for fear of coming up short and then deemed a failure, or deemed like, you didn't make it, so, you're a failure. That's okay. Putting a number out there is okay because it gives us a measuring point. It says, are we succeeding? Or are we not succeeding? Are we coming up short? And if we are coming up short, what do we need to modify? What do we need to change to make sure we can get to where we need to get? 25,000 housing units. We have 41,000 folks on any given night, sheltered as well as unsheltered in Los Angeles. What do we need to do that can hold us accountable? And what are the tactics? But you have to have our North Star. If you don't have a North Star that's established, then let me say this. All you do is you meander. You meander aimlessly in the desert, blindfolded, not knowing exactly where you're going. You're piecemealing our way there. And ideally, it'd be us elected officials making the decisions within our control, but we may have a US federal judge, in this case, US federal judge David Carter, who may be making those decisions, whether it's a consent decree or perhaps even worse. And some folks may say consent decree is actually a good thing because years, if not decades, have demonstrated that folks can't get their act together, especially at the local government level, whether it's a consent decree or receivership. And lastly, let me say this. With the Safe Cities Initiative, what you had pointed out earlier, when you had 80 police officers in Skid Row in particular, arresting unhoused individuals, homeless individuals, we didn't do anything. All we did was move the ball. We said, we're going to arrest you. And in fact, we're criminalizing you because of poverty, because you don't have the ability, the financial wherewithal to secure a roof over your head. So as a result, we will criminalize you and we'll put you in jail. But all we did was go around in circles. And it cost taxpayers tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to book, to take fingerprints, photographs, to actually house you, in this case, county jail, but it was only temporary. You're eventually gonna get out. So all we did was go like this. It made us feel good, or it made the residents feel good. It made folks to say, damn, the streets are getting cleaned up. Streets will look better now. That's just a temporary. There was no permanent solution to deal with the magnitude of this humanitarian crisis, unlike anything we've ever seen before. And let me say this lastly. The very fact that we have so many unhoused individuals in Los Angeles is, as we know, it is shocking, but it leaves a very deep indelible mark of shame that one of the most wealthiest cities on planet Earth could have so many unhoused individuals living on our streets, relieving themselves because they have no access, to a restroom. This is the United States of America. This is the largest GDP on planet Earth in the history of humankind. This is California, the 5th largest economy on planet Earth. There's only 4 economies larger than that of California. The United States of America as a whole in the aggregate, China, Japan, Germany, and then the state of California. That means our GDP is larger than that of Macron's France. It's larger than Italy. It's larger than the UK, Boris Johnson's UK. It is larger than of Vladimir Putin's Russia, to put this in context. And it's unspeakable, it's inexcusable, and that's why we need a real plan and the political will to move forward where we can be held accountable with measurable results, or lack thereof, to make sure we put a roof over our unhoused community members' heads.
I love all of that, Kevin, and I'm really glad that you took your time to really explain your position. It's important that the people who are watching, students in law school, are the ones I'm first and foremost thinking about, of course, but lawyers as well, and judges who are tuning in. What I really want my students to appreciate is what we're hearing from a lawmaker. This is, we hear a lot about what judges do, and when we're talking about cases in the classroom, a lot of times we're talking about the common law, but much law is statutory law, is enacted law, and this is a lawmaker who the judges' verbal formulation are being interpreted by the judge, right? And so we're getting to see from a lawmaker's perspective the kinds of things that he is thinking about, the values that he's guided by as he's framing legislation that's going to address this particular problem we're talking about now, and that is houselessness and the poverty governance in the form of houselessness. And he could have sat here and said some things about, how poverty is a result of, internal deficiencies and a culture of poverty. And so they just got to fix that and we don't have to worry about it. And if he had taken that position, his legislation would reflect that perspective, right? His legislation would, his approach to the problem would reflect that analysis of it. He is taking a different approach, and Kevin, a very different approach, and I think it's one that is supported by the data, the research out there. It's just the one that is empirically, sound. I have one question further though, Kevin, as you were talking, and I remember especially, I think somebody's got something on the background. Is that everyone checking their mute mic? Okay. Okay, but Kevin, I was really moved by your description of what we would be doing as a community if we had an earthquake and we had a similar number, 40 or 50,000 of our fellow Angelenos on the street, families and all, with tents over their heads, right? You said we would do something about it, right? And rightly, right? We would do something about that. We would get help to those people. That raises the question then though, Kevin, for me, of are we not responding to the distress of those people that way because they're Black and brown people? When I'm thinking about Hurricane Katrina, and the 9th Ward after Hurricane Katrina. When you have Black people literally standing on rooftops with water up to their necks, if you can remember the footage from those times, the helicopter footage, literally water up to their chest and necks, and one day goes by. These are Black people in distress, in crises. When we're talking about crises and crisis management, does the demography of those people who are in crisis matter to our response, right? Well, those Black bodies standing on those rooftops with water up to their necks, one day goes by, 2 days go by, 3 days go by, 4 days in, I see pictures of Sean Penn rowing up in a rowboat, handing out fresh water because FEMA still hadn't gotten its act together, right? To do something about those Black bodies in distress. Compare that response, Kevin, to the one that Americans had after the 9/11 tragedy, when those planes ran into those buildings in 9/11, right? There was a panic of empathy for those victims, and we just got it done. We didn't want to hear about bureaucratic impediments. We didn't want to hear about red tape. We have the same panic of empathy we would have for a family member who is in distress, right? When you don't have to have general human empathy, but you really want to do something about it. And so there's in my book, in *GGA Theory, I go into a lot of empirical literature about how at the level of the mirror neurons, there is an empathy deficit when it comes to Blacks and out-group members, right? By in-group members, it's an unconscious process, but there's just not the same level of care and concern for out-group members as in-group members, and right? So given that, Kevin, how do we humanize for Angelenos and for Californians, humanize the people in Skid Row so that they feel about them like they would about any other Angeleno in an earthquake or in another crisis that we all were going to come to the support of?
Well, let me say that there's clearly a lack of urgency among the city, the county, as well as LAHSA, and there's an acceptance of the way things have been done and continue to be done. It's almost as if we have acquiesced to the process rather than change the process to meet the needs of the unhoused. Just 2 days ago, the LA Times reported that the city hasn't even filed for federal reimbursements of nearly $60 million, money that we desperately need to house even more people. And the response is that we'll have the paperwork in by the end of the month. But I don't know about you and everyone who's watching, but if I had $60 million waiting for me, I would pull all-nighters like I was back in college to get that money that's necessary to make sure that our unhoused community members get access to the benefits. Now, you make some very valid points, and I won't get into the sort of the visceral and the psychological, in and out, I think it speaks for itself with regards to, again, empirically, the data numbers. Homelessness impacts everybody across the board. No question about it. White, Black, Latino, African American, Asian American, Middle Eastern. But without question, it's just not, anecdotal, but we have the empirical evidence which communities it disproportionately impacts and what the response is or lack thereof, with a sense of urgency and a sense of immediacy. Now, I surely don't know what people think, what's in their minds, those in positions of power to make the decisions, whether we improve the human condition or not, regardless of who you are, where you come from, the color of your skin, which God you pray to, who you love, your legal status. We're all human beings that deserve dignity and respect. So it's not a question of just policy changes. Policy is very important. As you say, they become statutory as a lawmaker. We got the three branches of government. We got the executive, we got the judicial, and obviously we got, the legislative branch. I'm a lawmaker, I make laws. Oftentimes I'm sued, The last lawsuit that I endured was the former Attorney General of the United States of America from Alabama, Jeff Sessions. He came to California and he sued California as Attorney General, the former Attorney General, the head of the Department of Justice under then President Donald Trump, against Sanctuary State Bill. I made California the first and largest sanctuary state in the country. And that was in response to the ICE raids, tearing our families apart, pulling, young babies and young girls and boys away from the arms of the mothers. He deemed it unconstitutional in the front to our nation. So he took us to court, and obviously went to U.S. federal court, went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court justices rejected the case. They didn't hear the case, which was a victory for us, and it was a big blow to the Department of Justice. But I like to write laws where I like to give judges very little latitude in terms of interpreting and making their own decisions. So I try to make it as proof as possible to manifest the overall objective of what you want to create, what you want to change, again, to improve the human condition. The very fact that we have so many, men and women and increasingly mothers, single mothers with children living on our streets today, we need a much more robust, we need a much more bold, response, but you have to have the political will that comes with it too. As lawmakers, we can make laws. As we know, people follow the law, they obey the law, they break the law, or they just ignore the law altogether. So you need the political will that comes with it, that says, to a city like LA, a great city like LA, that it is unacceptable that we have so many people living on our streets. And the very fact that it's so glaring that it's people of color, in particular African Americans and Latinos, and even more so when you go into Skid Row, and I'll say this. Sometime last year, I took some family members who were from out of town, and I took them to Skid Row. And I took them to Skid Row purposefully, with intention. And they were floored, they were dismayed, they were stunned, and they said, no puede ser increíble, imposible. This can't be, this is incredible, this is impossible. Este lugar parece el tercer mundo. This place looks like the third world. To which another family member said, aptly so, I would say, correctly so, that's an insult to third world nations. So to put this in context, in developing nations, whether it's within our own Western hemisphere or elsewhere, when you have weak democratic institutions for a whole variety of reasons, colonialism, neo-colonialism, internal colonialism, you have weak democratic institutions, executive, judicial, legislative. They never really gave people an opportunity to live life to the fullest and have a real opportunity economically to succeed. And therefore, the large migrations leaving developing nations coming to the United States of America. Now, that being said, again, we're the second largest city in America. We're one of the wealthiest cities, not just in America, but on planet Earth. And the very fact that we have so many people, it should be shocking. And I want it to shock. I'm sure you and everyone else, it should continue to shock us viscerally, because when we become numb to it, when we sort of get subsumed by the machine, by the institutions where we work, where we govern, then we start, becoming more distant from it. And then we take a lackadaisical sort of attitude. Yeah, we have a problem. We got to figure it out. We'll have a bureaucratic response. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to see so many Black and brown bodies, on our sidewalks, on our streets, in our alleyways, every single day, especially in Skid Row. Again, let me emphasize, if LA is the epicenter of homelessness, then CD14 Skid Row is ground zero. And it is just, we can't do this any longer. We have to move with a sense of force, with a sense of immediacy, with a sense of urgency. That does mean, shaking up the current status quo, the establishment, the institutions, that as well-meaning as they are, the result is I'm looking at the outcomes, and the outcomes by any objective measurement is coming up woefully short. So it doesn't make a difference if you're very well-intentioned, if you're a master's in social work, if you're a licensed clinical social worker, whatever titles that you may hold, and just an example, as we look at coronavirus and we look at the PCR examinations, who got access to it, who didn't, and you fast forward, now we're dealing with the vaccinations themselves. And we look at the empirical evidence, the data points, and we see which communities are being devastated in terms of infection rates as well as mortality rates, but where are the vaccinations going to? And who's receiving the vaccinations? I mean, this is 2021, and this is California and Los Angeles. This is unacceptable. And as policymakers, as public health directors, and as MDs and PhDs, people who pride themselves in terms of their decision-making, how they inform their decision-making with empirical evidence, all the data is there. But the will, the initiative, the political, thrust to get it done has been largely absent. And even with COVID-19, which we have always known, the pre-existing conditions that have existed of the deep-rooted systematic inequities that have been there pre-COVID-19, what COVID-19 has done is really, brought to the surface overtly in a very raw, very polarizing, very polemic, very ugly manner, how deep these fissures really are based on the color of your skin, your zip code, and your legal status.
Yeah, Kevin, the political will point, you made that a couple of times, and it does seem so key. So let's go back to that for a moment. And we did see the political muscle, if you will, political will exercised by the electorate itself when it came to electing Gascon as the new DA and Measure J, for example, right? And that was the result of a lot of grassroots activism. That's really a ringing success story about grassroots activism, right? Now, can we see any similar kind of grassroots activism that can put houselessness on the agenda, like the protesters and activists over the summer put police brutality and criminal justice reform on the top of the agenda? How can we get the political will in the sense of getting voters to feel that way, activists to drive the voters, and then them in turn to drive the politicians, right, the lawmakers, to make these changes we're talking about? Do you see any way we can get the same kind of energy for houselessness as we got? Because as you pointed out, it is also a Black Lives Matter issue. It's grossly disproportionate. You look at the demographics in Skid Row, you see it's a Black Lives Matter issue, but it's not framed that way. It hasn't caught on in the same way. Is there a way to do that from a political messaging standpoint?
Let me say a couple of things. One, you're absolutely right. For whatever reasons, the issue of homelessness and the root causes of homelessness and why it has disproportionately impacted, people of color more so, at least here in Southern California and in Los Angeles, has not among the activist class really taken root. They're conscious, they're very conscientious about it, but it hasn't in terms of maybe part of the agenda or their list of priorities to move forward. Obviously, as we witnessed, during the course of the summer and last year, the tens of thousands of folks who came out in the streets to raise their voices, for justice and for institutional reforms as it relates to communities of color. The issue of homelessness wasn't front and center. There's no question about it. But I do want to give recognition and props to brothers like Pete White, from LA Kent, brothers like General Jeff, Skid Row residents who've been in the trenches for years, if not decades, leading this fight at a very grassroots level, challenging the establishment, the authorities, demanding excellence as it relates to the catastrophe, the human crisis that is the issue of homelessness in Los Angeles, but in particular in this case in Skid Row. I'm going to say this. The issue of immigration is a very polemic and polarizing issue, as we know. There's people for it. There's people just against it. The issue of climate change is also a polarizing issue in our own nation. You know, as I travel and I've given speeches, you know, globally on the issue of climate change, that's more of my expertise, you know, energy and renewable energy and climate change policy. By far and large, throughout the world, it is not a controversial issue. People recognize it's real. In the US, because it is not a scientific issue, it's a political issue. It's a leadership issue. So it is polarizing. You got folks who believe in facts and science. You got other folks who don't believe in facts and science. A woman's right to choose, Roe versus Wade, in this country is still controversial. I believe strongly in a woman's right to choose. There are others who don't. The point I want to make with these three examples is that there are high profile, you know, issues that are largely still polarizing in our nation. Now, the issue of homelessness, whether you're on the left, you're in the middle, moderate, or you're on the right, is one issue that everyone agrees upon. Now, there may be some tactical differences, or there may be some philosophical differences as to why you ended up homeless. But putting that aside, whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, or points in between, I think by far and large, Angelenos want this issue to be tackled with a sense of vigor, you know, and energy, because they see what was historically isolated and segregated in a geographical area, Skid Row, and also Hollywood and Venice, three main locations. But even in low-income, marginalized, vulnerable neighborhoods, but proud neighborhoods, such as Watts and South LA and Ball Heights, even with the deep entrenched poverty, you never had physically a homeless population until just recently. And you've seen the numbers increase quite dramatically. So you have seen the numbers hemorrhage outside of the metaphorical, imaginary lines, walls of Skid Row throughout the city. So we see it in Echo Park, we see it in Silver Lake, we see it in Eagle Rock, we see it in Highland Park, we see it in the west side of LA, in Midtown LA, in Koreatown. Now it is on the consciousness of the vast majority of the electorate. So it doesn't make a difference if you live in Chatsworth or if you live in a neighborhood where physically you really don't have a presence of unhoused individuals. The fact that you see it on the news every day, you know, at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 11 p.m., it has reached the consciousness of all Angelenos that they want results. And I think in some ways that bodes actually good for the issue of homelessness, believe it or not, I believe, because it's not just folks of color and folks who live in marginalized communities who want this to be resolved in some form, way, or fashion. At the very least, remember, as I said earlier, when we're dealing with mental illnesses, when we're dealing with the issue of addictions and illicit drugs that still continue to come over in a voracious appetite for it on our side, you know, when it deals with the issue of deep systemic institutional racism that not one single policy or two or three or four or five are going to erase and resolve, you know, those fissures that deeply exist in our society today. But if we, within ourselves, within our control, can put a roof over our head, whether it is prefabricated modular housing that provides a price point of value to create the volume that we need, whether it's the issue of getting our friends in Congress to increase the value of Section 8 housing, which, by the way, has not been increased in decades. Whether it's the issue of master leasing, where we become the master leaseor. So if you're looking for an apartment, but because of, you know, these internal battles that you're facing, your FICO score is not great, your credit history is not great, you don't have a stream of income revenue that's sufficient enough to put that roof over your head for a landlord to say, you know what, sign up here, you're ready to go. Here are the keys right here. Well, don't worry about that. We will be the master leaser. We will take care of that. We will find your apartment somewhere throughout the city, and we will be in charge of that stream of revenue directly to the landlord right there. Whether it's adaptive reuse and buying buildings, and as a result of those buildings, we ourselves are going to convert those buildings at a much remarkably less expensive price point so we can put our folks into housing. Put our folks into housing right now. You know, I took office in December. On December 29th of last year, we closed escrow on 2 hotels in El Sereno on Huntington Drive. And we closed escrow on December 29th. It's about 100 and plus, you know, units. We're going to convert them into temporary and then eventually permanent housing. These are distressed assets because of COVID-19. The flow of tourism, the flow of business, you know, travelers has plummeted quite dramatically. So we have folks holding notes on mortgages that right now they're in over their heads. So we as government can come in and say, you know, negotiate on pennies on the dollar, a fair price, and say, we'll acquire that physical asset. And as a result, convert those assets into a roof, that housing that our community so sorely needs. Now, remember one thing, when we take our homeless community, there's different cohorts, right? Some folks, you put a roof over their head, they stabilize, they get their act together, they move forward with life. Now, there are other folks that ain't gonna be the case. They need the permanent supportive services, the wraparound services, right? And then there's also another percentage, and albeit it is small, folks try to blow it up. The housing resistant folks, the folks, that's a very small percentage, but that dominates the narrative, right? Of folks who don't want any type of housing. There are individuals like that. There's no question about it, but it's a small percentage in reality. And those are deeper issues. Those are deeper issues with regards to, you know, how do we deal with something that's legally controversial, but it has to be put on the table, the issue of conservatorship. If I'm running, you know, butt naked down the street and I have feces caked on me, I'm not well. So I need someone to help me. I need someone to help me and give me the help that I need. But even our psychiatric mental health services system from within the county, the largest in the nation, is not doing well itself. So we have systems that are completely misaligned. They're misaligned. And we have resources that are inefficiently, you know, spent. We have to align these systems correctly, but we have to move with a sense of urgency, a sense of immediacy. Like I said, going to the point, if we had an earthquake, and you had 50, 60,000 people who are living in our parks on the streets, we would move heaven and earth. We got to do the same thing. Now, I don't know what people think about, because if they see the color of their skin, therefore, you know what? I'll take my time on this one right here. You know, I don't want to think that way. It is what it is. Folks will come to their own conclusions. But I just want to say that regardless of who they were, living on the streets, we just got to move with a sense of urgency to give them a modicum of dignity and respect for their own health, for their own mental health, to stabilize their lives to a certain degree, to clean our streets up, to give us a sense of civic pride as a city, and also, just as importantly, to have our children who have normalized, when they see the underpasses, overpasses, and all the tents, that this is normal. This is just normal. It's not normal. It's abnormal. And we have to treat it that way. It's abnormal, it's shocking, it's shameful, and that's why we have to go for it and then throw everything we have at it in a very smart, intelligent, efficient way, fiscal-wise, money-wise, so we can get the results and we can get the value because of the volume of individuals living on our streets today.
Great, Kevin. I see Olivia has appeared, so that means we have some questions afoot, right? Great. I'm going to let you take over the questions then.
Okay, so we have gotten some great questions. Thank you so much, Honorable Kevin De Leon, for your comments and just great ideas, and just very excited about what you've been working on since you've taken office just months ago. So that's really exciting. I have a question from one of your constituents. She is a resident of downtown Los Angeles. She said, council member, as I'm sure you're aware, elections are currently underway for neighborhood councils, including DLANC. DLANC has long been controlled by white residents of downtown Los Angeles, with many with ties to real estate developers. Your predecessor also helped block the creation of a Skid Row neighborhood council in 2016. how does your office plan to engage local communities in a meaningful way, particularly to hear from the communities most impacted by the issues we are discussing, rather than just those who are the squeakiest wheels or maybe the best most resourced individuals?
Well, thank you, Olivia, and thank you for the question. And whoever posed that question, perhaps also too, you could give me your name and phone number, if not openly, on the chat. And Olivia, you can give me the name and number, for my staff, so my staff can contact this individual. I think that without knowing the particulars, obviously, of the governance, within downtown Los Angeles and the various neighborhood councils, one thing I want to say is this: it is important that all voices are heard in downtown LA. Downtown LA is not your grandfather's downtown of the past, where in by 9 and out by 5, it's a ghost town. Increasingly, we have a lot of family members. It's an actual neighborhood that wants more parks, more open space. They want walkability. And it's also home, to one of the largest homeless population in the United States of America. We have to coexist with each other. We have to be there with each other. We can't separate each other. It's our reality. So having that voice and validating that voice, and hearing that voice is important to me. So if we can make sure we get that information and we pass it on, I think my Pete Brown is on our Zoom call too. So we can forward that information, Olivia. That'd be fantastic.
Certainly. And we've gotten several questions about just how the failures of the sweeps that have been going on in our city and other cities across California and America, where we just try to chase away homeless individuals and get them out of sight, out of mind. So what are you doing in your office? How can we help as advocates to adapt to, and how can we fix or adapt to the commodification of housing in order to create actual housing, like you mentioned in El Sereno? How can we bolster those efforts and stop the sweeping?
Olivia and Dr. Armour, let me fess up to something. When I was in the state Senate and my office was on Sunset Boulevard, right in Echo Park, I used to get phone calls from other elected officials. And they would ask me if I could call Caltrans, and the CHP, so they can remove the homeless encampments, on or near the freeways and the underpasses, so then okay, that's fine. I direct the staff member, call Caltrans so you can move the folks there. And this would happen with monthly occurrence. And then something one day hit me like a 2x4 on the forehead. And wait a second, what am I doing? Because if you have state property, that's, let's say, the Hollywood 101 freeway, and you move them from the state property, all you did was move them 1 block to city property. So we didn't do anything about the issue of homelessness. We didn't do anything, the issue about putting a roof over their head or shelter, whether it be non-congregate or congregate shelter. And I know a lot of folks don't like congregate shelter, but we didn't move the ball. And that's when I stopped doing it. I said, you know what, when the elected officials, council members start calling, say no, or put them on the phone with me and I'll say directly no. And that's when we started thinking about this differently, because it's like whack-a-mole, right? It was like, I went down to Skid Row in late 2014 with my predecessor, then President Darrell Steinberg, and a good friend of mine who's currently the mayor of the city of Sacramento. And we spent the day in Skid Row, and we had everyone there: city attorney's office, LAPD, the rescue missions, LASA, mental health services, a whole group of individuals. Long story short, when I left the meeting, it was very illuminating. I left more confused and befuddled and perplexed. And these are very smart people who have years of experience on this issue, much more than I have right now. But I just look at what the outcomes look like. And you walk out and you see Skid Row. And you say, what? The PowerPoint deck presentation was amazing, and the PhDs and the MDs and the masters in social work, and all these folks were so smart and amazing. But then I look at the outcomes. and it's like this, right there. So the sweeps don't work in that sense when you're moving folks, because one thing I realized, and I get a lot of calls, by the way, so that you know, numerous calls from folks who want folks moved. And let's be fair too, folks have a right to get access to their own doorway, whether it's a resident or it's a business. So folks have that right too. But one thing I realized was that if I had folks move from this block, they're just going down to the next block. And then those folks are gonna call me. And that's all it is. It's just this merry-go-round that's nonsensical. And that's why we came up, with the plan, A Way Home. The only way you can't cut corners, you can't cheat. It is the issue of housing. Services are very important, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's about housing. Outreach, you can do outreach all you want. Remember, I think it was George W. Bush back in the day, a bridge to nowhere. You don't want an outreach to nowhere. An outreach where you got a clipboard and check, 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 check. If you don't got a place to send them to, the outreach is important, getting your birth certificate, your social security card, identification card, to get the services, to draw down on money, that's all very important. But ultimately, it has to go to the issue of housing. That's why we say homeless, unhoused, because there's no roof over their head, And so I've learned a lot of lessons myself too, personally, things that I've learned, and I've made mistakes myself, and rethought things out too. And a lot of good folks too have helped me think things in a very different way as well. I sort of meandered, my answer there, but.
No, very excellent. Right on point. Don't worry. So we also have a question from Daniel Wolf. What about construction of small/micro SRO infill projects built over parking lots and shopping centers, for example? Why can't zoning and building codes be changed to permit these? These can be done beautifully and inexpensively. This is one option.
Let me say that Mr. Wolf's commentary is, I agree with him 100%. And he's absolutely right. We have to be creative, and we have to be innovative, and we have to cut all the red tape that prevents the type of innovation and creativity that's preventing us by putting a roof over their head. There's some folks who are not happy with me, and they've been supporters of mine, politically, in the nonprofit world, and in terms of housing developers. But the reality is this, is that it's outrageous that we have $700,000 per unit, units, because ultimately it's taxpayer dollars, because what you want to do is you want to stretch that dollar as far as you can. Because if we were a city that had a manageable, unhoused population, where we believe we had the financial wherewithal to build, construct, or to adapt or reuse, to put a roof over the head, then you have a lot of luxury. You have a lot of room to play with. But given the magnitude of this gargantuan humanitarian crisis, with the money that we have to use it wisely, the most efficiently, and stretch it to the best of our ability. So the innovation and the creativity, I've seen bureaucracies just like squash it. And this is not a time to squash, because you have people who are being exposed to hypothermia, being exposed to the elements, that brutal sun with climate change right now. And when you're lying on, how many times have we been to Skid Row? And we've seen folks just lying, on that sidewalk, and that brutal sun just hitting that individual, just absolutely brutal. That's why we got to move with urgency. To Mr. Wolf's, thoughts, and if Mr. Wolf could also forward, also to those suggestions to us, I would appreciate that very much, sir.
Thank you. Yes. And we also had, just to add on to what Pete said, Gina had also recommended, there are so many vacant buildings in Los Angeles, apartments and houses. What about a vacancy tax, a significant one? So I'll ask her also to forward her suggestion to okay. Pete Brown. So thank you.
Let me say something too. What will be very interesting is post-COVID with the vaccinations is how we, redefine work and what work looks like, especially for those who have very high educational attainments. Is it going to be through Zoom and Google as opposed to commuting? So what happens with commercial property, especially commercial property class, B and C, perhaps not class A, but B and C with no revenue coming in? Does that pose an opportunity for us to occupy these types of vacancies at a better rate? If I own all this commercial property and because of COVID, now I have empty, spaces everywhere, does this give us an opportunity to say, hey, you know what, let's negotiate and let's use this, tangible asset that you have on your books, in your portfolio, and see what we can do to put a roof over our folks' head and do so in a manner that's dramatically less expensive, and convert those into residencies for unhoused community members. And that's not to say they don't deserve class A, but that ain't gonna happen.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I love all the innovation going on and your receptiveness to it. And thank you all to the attendees for asking questions. We've also gotten a couple questions about how to get engaged, either law students that are going into private practice that want to do pro bono, people that are already working in legal services organizations, but also just anyone who lives in Los Angeles. What advice can you give to them? And how they can better advocate for our neighbors who are unhoused, and just what would be your takeaway from this event? What can people do?
Olivia, it's Olivia. It's a very apropos question that you asked me, especially because there's a lot of young folks who are in law school right now. Now, we have had a litigation merry-go-round in Los Angeles. We've had the Jones versus LA lawsuit. We've had the Levon versus LA lawsuit. We've had the Desert Train versus LA lawsuit. We've had the Mitchell versus LA lawsuit. We've had the Garcia versus LA lawsuit. And the current lawsuit is the LA Alliance versus the city of Los Angeles. We have 6 major, lawsuits against the city of LA on the issue of homelessness. And this is what I'm talking about. You cannot go and continue on the litigation merry-go-round and having judges always decide our fate. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it may come down to that. And the Boise decision, obviously, that was tangentially related to LA, but had a huge impact on LA because the Boise, the Western, district, takes in California. I had a phone conversation with the plaintiffs, the lead plaintiffs this morning of the LA Alliance versus the city of LA. And there's a preliminary injunction hearing that's coming up within 3 weeks in the U.S. federal courthouse of U.S. federal judge David Carter. That is using the power and the weight, obviously, of the law to force, change, as opposed to a policymaker. But, ultimately, at the end of the day, whether it's statutory or whether it is through litigation, obviously, biasly, subjectively, I always prefer statutorily as a lawmaker. But if folks can get their act together and if it's done litigation-wise, so be it. So for those folks who want to get involved, obviously, right now, I would speak with legal aid, I would speak with folks like the LA Alliance, folks who have come together, but what I look for is sort of kind of like piecemeal, not piecemeal, I should say, but you need a global solution because it is not just this lawsuit about, my physical possessions, which is important, but I want a global solution, whether it's statutory or it's driven by litigation through a consent decree that says this is our overall goal to deal with the issue of homelessness. Now, we're always going to have a number of unhoused individuals, as long as we have the systemic racism and everything that I described. But we can manage the number of folks that live on the streets today by forcing the policies, the regulations, and the resources and channeling those resources to make sure we put a roof over their head. It's not the panacea. It's not the panacea, but it is one huge gargantuan step forward by giving a modicum of dignity and respect, by putting that roof over your head that helps stabilizes your life so you can move forward right there. So I don't have all the phone numbers to give, to all the folks right now, but they can call my office as well too. Or Pete Brown, Pete, if you can put our phone number, the office phone number, on the chat room right there, that'd be great. If no one answers, you have to leave a voicemail, please do so, because our phones have been jammed because of the vaccination sites that we have going on right now in the district.
All right. So thank you so much for your time. We've gone quite a bit over, so I apologize to everyone, but thank you to everyone thank you to Councilmember De Leon. Thank you, Professor Armour. I just wanted to plug quickly. We put Pete Brown's, the email into the chat. I don't have his number at the moment, but also if anyone is interested in keeping up to date with what District 14 is doing, I have to recommend following Councilmember De Leon on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. He's at K De Leon. Really great content if you want to hear about how to get engaged. You can also follow the Fair Housing Collective at FHC_LA on Twitter and Instagram for updates on how you can advocate for our unhoused neighbors. And also check out our own socials at ACS Los Angeles. And thank you so much for everyone's questions and for attending. And please, like Councilmember De Leon suggested, stay active, hold your representatives accountable, reach out to their offices, be really engaged and active, and we'll move the needle on this. And we really appreciate your time today and sharing.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you very much. Professor Armour, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Take care.
All right, bye.